Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this latest narration of the web series The Survivor Becomes the Dungeon. If you're new to the series, there is a playlist listed down below in the description, and as always, I hope that you enjoy. Chapter 149, V.R.E. Point of View. After having finished the removal of the ruined buildings and leaving behind all the personal effects I managed to repair and recover with their respective families, along with salvageable building materials in some kind of clearing, I made my way over to Vivia Lucvan in the plaza where she said she'd be. Finding the elite woman with some kind of clipboard in hand, accompanied by two other guards giving their various reports about something or another. Surprisingly enough, I could sense that she noticed my approach with her artificial eye glancing in my general direction when she locked onto me again, a smile coming onto her lips as she properly looked up from her reports to turn her head towards me. "Ah, Mage Vito, it is good to see you again. I take it that you are done with clearing the ruined homes?" she asked in an almost pleasant way, letting the clipboard fall to her side as she gave me her full attention. The guards at her side seemed to stiffen at my approach with a healthy amount of intimidation and awe, as they weren't sure what to make of me, the duo not having noticed me coming over to them, unlike their superior. I just offered a small smile at the group before regarding Rivia directly, as I did my best to pretend to be worn out, but not outright exhausted. "Yes, all the buildings have been cleared away, and the thick mud from the firefighting efforts has been dried down to a damp soil. I've also taken the liberty to leave all the salvageable wood, stone, and brick in a clearing close to the village, to be used wherever it may be needed," I explained, with no small amount of pride in my voice. After all, I was more than happy to help in ways I could really only dream of back in my old life. Vivia looked clearly surprised by the summary of my actions before I got a sensation of gratefulness coming from her, as she smiled more sincerely and nodded at my words. "I see. You continue to do so much for us, with almost nothing in return. Are you sure there is no way that we can compensate you?" she asked, her eyes searching my face before looking me up and down as she tried to rack her mind for anything besides simple coin to give me for my efforts. I had to think about it. It wouldn't do to keep stonewalling this family attempts at trying to make things even, or at least pay me back in some way after everything I've done today. After a few moments, I just let out a sigh before smiling a bit more as I sheepishly scratched my cheek. "Well, if you insist," I started to say as Vivia perked up with interest. "I began my travels with only a small selection of undead. Only my best, after all, though that may have been wishful thinking on my part. If you don't mind sparing the effort, I would like for you to collect any of the remaining dead raiders from around the village and gather them for me. While I may not use all of them, the best amongst them will prove to be quite useful in my service," I explained, doing my best to sound like a necromancer based on the image Trelio and Aspen seemed to have in their minds during our meeting earlier today. "No, but I only want the raiders. I have no interest in any of the dead mercenaries, guards, soldiers, or villagers that have nothing to do with the attack on this place. Call it a quirk of mine, but I prefer to only use my enemies to my benefit, not innocents." Vivia looked rather thoughtful of my request, having not exactly expected that line of dialogue in particular. The more I spoke, the more intrigued and even pleased Vivia appeared to be, as she simply nodded her head once I finished. "Yeah, I see. Well, if that's truly what you want, then I'll be glad to have some of my people make the effort. It'll certainly save the time of having to make a mass grave for the bastards, that's for sure," she enthused rather cheerfully, despite the grim subject matter. She then looked between the two guards beside her before settling on an armored dogkin man. "Well, you heard the Mage Vito. Spread the word and scour the village for any remaining foreign soldiers," she ordered, the dogkin guard nodding at her words before saluting and making his way off. Vivia then looked at the remaining guard, who was some kind of birdkin woman in light armor, before handing off the clipboard and scrolls that she had. "Take this to my daughter and let her know she'll be in charge for a little while. I'll be escorting Mage Vito to his quarters," she explained with a bit of a smile, the guard nodding as well as she took up the items before unfurling her wings, which had been tightly closed against her back, and taking flight. With her hands now freed, Vivia looked at me before waving me along. "If you'll walk with me, Mage Vito, as promised, accommodations will be provided for you to rest until you join us for dinner tonight," she mentioned as she began to walk towards the stone bridge that led to the bailey. "You also mentioned something about a place for my people, no?" I asked in confirmation, as I matched her pace while following along at her side. Vivian nodded in response to that as well. "Now, of course, we have the space to welcome a considerable entourage for any visiting persons of interest, though you'll be given one of our finer rooms as our guest of honor, of course," she said rather proudly as she glanced at me with a false eye. "It's just a shame that I won't be able to enjoy the comforts beyond the visual appeal of it all." "That sounds quite nice. Say, you wouldn't happen to have any bathing facilities?" I asked while reaching up and doting on B-Robbo as he continued to sleep rather soundly. "I may have rinsed off earlier, but I can still smell the stench of blood clinging to my body, and I'd like to try and get a bit more presentable for dinner tonight." Even as I asked the question, I started to have second thoughts. "Better yet, if you could just bring me a large tub and some soap. I'll fill it with water myself." Vivian went to open her mouth, about to talk about bathing facilities that were available within her home, but she just smiled as I continued to speak before nodding her head intently. "If that's what you'd like, then sure. We can make those arrangements for you once you've settled in your room," she mentioned cheerfully enough as some soldiers opened a pair of large double doors which led into a small castle she called home before closing the doors behind us. Looking around, I could tell that I was surrounded by a good deal of opulence, but it was nothing compared to the excess of luxury that I had seen while pretending to be friends with some clients' kids during my youth, or even compared to some of the particularly showy leaders of various groups during the apocalypse. Some who were the gregarious figures and fond of flashy, while others were egotistical arseholes who clung to the ideas of old-world wealth, who were just better-dressed bandits. Perhaps it was unfair to compare the level of opulence that I knew from my world to that of this world. Hell, if I remember things correctly, the people of the medieval era, which loosely resembled the general societal level of this world, considered something as simple as a pineapple as a grand luxury, even to the point where noble households would rent them for parties as centerpieces. Then again, they had things like magic in this world, and so the level of excess varied wildly from one end of the spectrum to the other. Things like having a crystal-powered light fixture present on a column every 20 feet or so on both sides of the hallway seemed to be held in the same regard as the beautifully carved statues and hallways spanning carpets. Focusing back on the moment after considering my surroundings, I cast a curious glance over at Vivian as I tried to find something to speak about. Though, as I glanced over at her, she apparently decided to glance at me with a false eye, and I could tell that she was wondering what sorts of subjects to broach while we walked. After another few steps, I decided to take the initiative and piped up. "I hope you'll forgive my bluntness, but is your false eye more than some kind of prosthetic?" I had an odd feeling, but the fact that she had actively spotted me in the crowd after a cursory glance and approached me more than once had me curious. While I may not have been actively trying to hide, I've noticed most people have a hard time spotting me or hearing me approach in general. So for her to have easily picked me out multiple times now was a distinct outlier. Vivian cracked a grin, smirking with amusement as she chuckled softly at my question for a moment. "I suppose a mage such as yourself would be interested in an eye like mine," she considered, as her hand came up to gently trace the lower half of the scar that crossed over her eye. After taking yet another moment to consider herself, she simply nodded to herself. "Yes, my eye is more than just a simple prosthetic. My parents had sunk a considerable fortune into the manufacturing of my eye to ensure that my life as a warrior wouldn't have come to an untimely end during my youth," she mentioned in rather good spirits, as her hand fell back to her side. "Beyond allowing me to see normally, it also gives me several types of enhanced sight if I direct my mana to charge up my eye beyond its base functions. It gives me the far sight of an eagle, allowing me to make out fine details beyond even the scope of most individuals who have mana hearts. It also allows me to see concentrations of mana, allowing me to determine if an item or an area is magical, or even if a person has a mana heart or mana rings." At that, I glanced over at her again, and I could feel the unease travel up my metaphorical spine. Vivian stopped walking, and I stopped beside her, as she turned to face me, while still looking pleasantly amused. "It also allows me to see through illusions and magical disguises," she said simply, as she then shrugged a bit. "You could say that my parents were just a little overprotective of me after I'd lost my eye, though I can certainly appreciate the concern," she mused as she reached out and gently flicked my forehead, the distinct thud of an armored finger on a wooden sounding out. I wasn't sure how to react, letting her flick my forehead as she confirmed with me that she had already known that I was a wooden man. Quite frankly, I was more surprised that I hadn't realized she'd known about me, as it wasn't on her mind when she interacted with me until now. It took me a moment to formalize a response, but I did my best to keep it as casual as I looked into her eyes and held a gaze. "So, how long have you known?" was all that I could really muster after a few seconds. Vivia just smiled a little more before tapping her chin in an exaggerated, thoughtful fashion. "Well, I'd say it was around the third house you worked on when you started pretending that you were tired," she said before letting her arm fall back to her side, as her forearm rested along the pommel of a blade rather casually. "I was trying to gauge your mana capacity for myself when I saw you surrounded by a thin but consistent layer of magic, and my curiosity got the better of me. So, what happens now?" I asked as I continued to hold her gaze. I could tell she was rather amused by the situation, and she was having some fun at my expense. But beyond that, I couldn't discern what she was intending to do with that information. She merely quirks a brow at my question and smiled a little more. "Well, for now, I'll finish walking you to your quarters as promised, and let you rest, and I'll have one of my servants bring you a tub to bathe in," she explained, simple enough, as she started to walk again. "That's it?" I couldn't help but ask, with no small amount of disbelief in my voice as I followed her again. She looked back at me again, a smile still on her lips. "Well, I'll need you to provide me with the descriptions of the members of your caravan, so that I can ensure that they're looked after as we promised, but, yeah." "So you don't care that I'm essentially just a fancy wooden golem?" I asked, deciding to just cut to the bone of the matter at hand as we ascended the flight of stairs. Vivia scoffed and chuckled at how I described myself, before looking over at me again. "Mage Vita, quite frankly, I don't care what you are. You could be 3 halflings in a trench coat for all I care. What you've done for me and my people today has earned you the privilege of that discretion," she explained rather sincerely, before looking ahead as she led me down another hall. "It's just a shame that you probably won't be able to enjoy the food at the feast we're holding in your honor tonight," she said, sounding truly disappointed by the notion that she finally stopped at a pair of large double doors. I wasn't sure what to say. One of my biggest secrets had been so easily exposed, and yet nothing came of it. No threats, no blackmail, no attempts to take advantage of me in any way. It's been years since I found myself in a position like this. To be at the mercy of someone like this and not have that perceived weakness or fault taken advantage of. Sure, if she tried anything like that, I would have many qualms in handling it, and yet it wasn't a problem to begin with. "Thank you," I finally managed to say, reaching up and just rubbing the back of my head as I thought of something else to say before deciding to pull the mana potion from my storage space, mentally pouring the liquid back into the bottle and holding it out to her. "Here, now that you know what I am, I suppose you could also tell I didn't actually need the potion," I mentioned with a sheepish smile. Vivian looked pleasantly surprised at the bottle suddenly appearing in my hands and gently plucked it up with a smile on her lips. "I was wondering about that," she mentioned distractedly, looking over the contents of the vial before tucking it away into a small pouch on her belt. She then looked through the same pouch and procured a chunky-looking silver key with detailed engravings on it that she placed in my hand. "Here, feel free to lock the door behind you if you need it." Holding the key in my ungloved hand, I ran my thumb against the engravings thoughtfully while looking the key over, before glancing back at Vivian and smiling a little more. "Thanks," I said simply, before closing my hand around it. "Ah, that's right. I was supposed to tell you about my caravan, wasn't I?" I asked, having been sufficiently distracted by her reveal that I had forgotten to go over it with her. "Right. We hadn't even gone over them yet," she said, as she had only just now remembered that was something that needed to be discussed. It took a few minutes, but I went about describing the key members of the group that she'd likely encounter, those being Rance, Chris, and Riley. However, I did make sure to tell her about the rest of the group, as well as Lugosi and Fraley, just so she could have a proper head count for the celebration tonight, if she needed it. As we spoke, she had ended up procuring a rolled-up piece of parchment and a fountain pen from the same small pouch that she'd pulled the key from, and began taking brief notes on the descriptions of my group members. It was only then that I realized that the pouch that she had on her hip was likely one of those magic items that were bigger on the inside, which was pretty interesting to see to be used despite the fact that I could use my storage space more easily. Once we were done, she rolled the parchment before tucking it and a pen away in the pouch once again. "All right, Mage Rita, I'll be off now. I hope you rest well," she said pleasantly, as she turned on her heel and began making her way off. Left to my own devices, I looked over the large double doors, sliding the key into the lock before making my way inside. The room was rather large, with a considerable-looking bed with a canopy and drapes for privacy. The bed itself was rather massive, looking as if it could fit at least 6 people rather comfortably, which did make me wonder what kind of entourage a visiting elite would bring along with them. Beyond the bed was a small seating area of 2 3-person couches, with a coffee table sitting between them. An ornate glass jar sat in the middle of the coffee table on a silver and gold pedestal, filled with some kind of potpourri. The walls around me were decorated with a number of landscape paintings that each had their own overly ornate flames, which looked to be just as expensive, if not more than, the paintings themselves, if I was looking at the quality of the materials right. Despite myself, I must have lost myself in studying the surroundings, as a firm knock at the double doors broke me from my focus. Making my way over and opening the doors, I am greeted by a sight of a rather muscular orcish maid. She carried a good-sized tub over her shoulder that looked like it could easily hold 200 gallons or so. "Hello there, great mage, I've brought your tub here for you," she said upon seeing me, while flashing a rather cheerful grin at first, before properly looking me over with a vague look of surprise. "Well, you are a right mess, are you?" she said rather bluntly, while making her way into my room when she began setting the tub down. "Would you perhaps like some assistance with your bath today? I've been told I'm great at easing tired muscles after a long day," she exclaimed rather proudly, and I could tell that she was rather sincere in her offer after seeing the state I was in. I mean, I know I was pretending to look tired, but I wonder how messed up I actually looked. I simply shake my head before offering a large woman a small smile. "Thank you, miss, but no. All I need is a long hot soak, and I think I'll be quite all right." The orcish maid looked a little unsure before relenting as she nodded once. "Very well, but if you need anything from us," she started to say, while pointing over at the innocuous rope that dangled from the ceiling by a massive bed. "Just pull on that rope a couple times and we'll be right over, okay?" "I'll keep that in mind, thank you," I replied sincerely enough, while standing by the door, holding it open for her. The large woman just smiled a little more before offering a surprisingly graceful courtesy. "Enjoy your bath, great mage," she said pleasantly, when she finally made her way out as I locked the door behind her. Now, finally on my own all over again, I go to pull off my poncho before remembering that Basmori is still sound asleep on my shoulder, despite all the activity and commotion that's gone on around us since the battle ended. Looking over Basmori more closely, I could see that his body practically glowed with mana as it coursed through him with every pulse of his mana heart. He was going through some big changes, that was for sure, but what exactly they would be was up in the air. I attempted to pull him off my shoulder at first, but once I realized that his claws were quite tangled in my raggedy poncho, I figured that I might as well just leave him with it, as I gently pulled him and my poncho off at once, before carefully laying him on the massive bed with poncho as a sort of blanket. Looking myself over, I couldn't see any noticeable damage beyond some thin layers of mud in my hands and forearms. Focusing on my vessel and suppressing the enchantment that gave me the illusion of skin, I'm rather surprised by the extent of the lingering damage that littered my wooden flesh. Just looking at my torso and arms, I could see a considerable amount of metal slag that had burned into my body, likely from when that mage I brutalized tried to kill me with their flames. I could see signs of slow regrowth where the wood attempted to grow around the metal, but it would probably be better for my mobility if I just removed the metal outright. Beyond that, my whole body was stained with a disgusting brownish maroon tinge of blood that had dried hours ago by now. I'm going to need to deep clean my body and boil it for sure. Further examination of my legs showed that they were in similar state as the top half of my body. The metallic armor wasn't just blackened and burned from the heat of the flames, but had melted and fused into my wooden flesh, which will likely require quite a bit of effort to pull out and peel away if I wanted to get the ruined equipment off. Well, I suppose now is as good a time as any to get started. End of chapter. I would just quickly like to thank the T5 peeps: Dragon Soup, Cold War Boomerwaffen, Sevaren Serberous, Red Panda 121, Leslie 517, Bushmaster 177, Casper Arnholtz, Cam Maxwell, Sans the Skeleton, Lightjock, Dragzoon W.R.E, and Lord Asrigal. Thank you very much.